The lamp was unlit. For a lighthouse perched on the jagged edge of the Outer Hebrides, a dark lantern is not merely an oversight. It is a distress signal. On the afternoon of December 26, 1900, the relief ship Hesperus dropped anchor near the Flannan Isles. The island of Eilean Mor rose from the freezing Atlantic like a tombstone. No flag flew from the staff. No provision boxes were left on the landing. And as the ship's whistle tore through the frigid air, no keepers emerged to greet it. The silence was absolute, a suffocating vacuum where the rhythm of human life had been abruptly severed. Relief keeper Joseph Moore was the first to ascend the steep stone stairs to the compound. The entrance gate was closed. The main door was shut fast. Inside, the profound stillness deepened. The kitchen revealed a scene frozen in an abrupt, unnatural interruption. A chair lay overturned on the stone floor. The clock on the wall had stopped. The ashes in the grate were cold. Records indicate that the lamps were trimmed and ready, the oil fountains filled. The men had not abandoned their duties. They had simply vanished from them. Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur were veterans of the sea. They understood the lethal temperament of the Scottish coast. Yet the physical evidence left behind on Eilean Mor defied maritime logic. Inside the living quarters, a solitary set of oilskins remained hanging on its peg. It belonged to MacArthur. In the unforgiving gales of a North Atlantic winter, stepping outside without heavy weather gear is a death sentence. The prevailing theory suggests a sudden emergency drew them out, but a seasoned keeper does not abandon his post half-dressed. The investigation moved from the pristine living quarters to the western landing. Here, the ocean had left its violent signature. Iron railings were twisted and bent out of shape. A heavy wooden box, stored securely at a height of over 100 feet above sea level, had been shattered. A massive boulder, weighing an estimated ton, had been displaced. It was as if a singular, catastrophic force had struck the island. But weather logs from nearby coastal stations recorded calm seas and clear skies during the days leading up to the discovery. The violence recorded on Eilean Mor existed in a vacuum, a localized destruction that left no trace on the surrounding world. The most unsettling fragments of this dossier survive in ink. The lighthouse logbook, recovered from the desk, chronicles an escalating descent into psychological terror. Entries from December 12 describe severe winds, the likes of which James Ducat had never seen in 20 years of service. Thomas Marshall, known to his superiors as a quiet and stoic man, was noted as crying. By December 13th, the log states that the men were praying. 3 veteran sailors, locked inside a state-of-the-art fortress designed to withstand the ocean's fury, reduced to weeping and prayer by a storm that no other station observed. The final entry is dated December 15th. It reads simply, "Storm ended, sea calm, God is over all." After that morning, human record ends. The Northern Lighthouse Board concluded that the men were swept away by an unexpected freak wave while attempting to secure the landing. It is a neat clinical explanation. It satisfies the bureaucratic need for closure. But it does not explain the tears of seasoned mariners. It does not explain the phantom storm that battered their minds while the surrounding seas remained placid. It does not explain the overturned chair, or why one man left his only defense against the cold, hanging on a hook. Eilean Mor remains a monument to the inexplicable. The lighthouse still stands, its beam cutting through the darkness, sweeping over the same black waters that swallowed 3 men without a trace. The evidence remains inconclusive. The sea keeps its secrets, and the archive remains open. We turn the pages of the Maritime Archive from the freezing gales of the North Atlantic to the sweltering expanse of the South Pacific. The ocean is vast, indifferent, and infinitely capable of erasing human endeavor. In October of 1955, it claimed the MV Joyita. She was an unsinkable ship, a 75-foot wooden vessel, heavily insulated with cork, designed to remain buoyant even if completely flooded. Yet when she was found drifting listlessly north of Fiji, she was a floating tomb. 25 passengers and crew had vanished. The departure was mundane, a routine trading voyage from Samoa to the Tokelau Islands, carrying medical supplies, timber, and empty oil drums. The journey should have taken less than 2 days. It never concluded. 5 weeks later, a passing merchant ship spotted her ruined silhouette on the horizon. The Joyita was listing heavily to port, her deck awash, her radio tuned to the International Distress Channel. No one answered the salvage crew calls. The silence aboard was absolute, heavy with the humid air of the tropics and the stench of rotting cargo. Boarding the derelict vessel was an exercise in forensic disorientation. The salvage team found a scene frozen in chaotic suspension. Barnacles clung to the waterlogged timber, pulling the port rail beneath the swells. The awning had been rigged to catch rainwater. It was a desperate, improvised survival tactic that spoke volumes about the final days aboard. Below deck, the water was waist-deep, dark and slick with oil. The ship logbook was missing. The navigational equipment was gone. 3 directional life rafts had been deployed, leaving nothing behind but frayed ropes swaying in the ocean breeze. The deeper investigators probed, the more the narrative fractured. The auxiliary pump had been rigged, but it was improperly connected. It was a fatal mechanical error. In the engine room, a mattress had been thrown over the starboard engine, either to muffle sound or to staunch a catastrophic leak. Most chilling of all was the doctor bag found on the deck. It belonged to a passenger, a surgeon en route to a remote clinic. Inside, salvage crews found 4 blood-stained bandages. Someone had been severely injured. Someone had been treated. But there was no sign of the patient, the doctor, or the blood they must have spilled on the wooden planks. To understand the fate of the Joyita, one must understand the relentless mechanics of the South Pacific equatorial system. It is a massive circulating conveyor belt of water. The ocean here does not merely hold a vessel, it dictates its trajectory with absolute authority. Naval hydrographers mapping the region in 1955 calculated that any drifting object would be caught in a complex web of converging currents. The Joyita had drifted hundreds of miles off her intended course. She was dragged through a labyrinth of coral reefs and deep water trenches, pushed by trade winds and pulled by the deep, invisible rivers of the sea. The vessel was trapped within this oceanic machine, yet she remained afloat. The cork lining her hull performed exactly as engineered, rendering the Joyita practically immune to the depths. She could not sink. The captain, an experienced mariner named Thomas Miller, knew this intimately. He knew his ship was a massive life preserver. The cardinal rule of the sea dictates that you never abandon a floating vessel for a raft. Yet the rafts were gone. Something compelled a seasoned captain and 24 souls to violate the most fundamental principle of maritime survival, trading an unsinkable fortress for fragile canvas in the open ocean. The formal inquiry convened in Apia, Samoa, attempting to impose bureaucratic order on a chaotic void. Investigators reconstructed the timeline with meticulous, almost desperate precision. They examined the cooling pipes of the port engine, discovering a fractured galvanized fitting. It was the source of the flood. Water had poured into the bilges, unnoticed until it breached the floorboards. But a flooded bilge is a crisis, not a death sentence. The inquiry records show that the ship radio had a severed aerial wire. They could transmit a signal for a mere 2 miles. They were screaming into the void, and the void did not hear them. Witness testimony from the dock workers who loaded the Joyita added a disturbing layer of friction to the official timeline. They reported that the port engine clutch was faulty before the ship even slipped its moorings. Captain Miller had departed on a single functioning engine. It was a calculated risk that compounded the unfolding disaster. When the cooling pipe burst, the water disabled the starboard engine. The ship lost power. She lost steerage. She became a dead weight wallowing in the swells. The inquiry concluded that a sudden panic must have seized the passengers, forcing the captain into a premature evacuation. But panic is a fragile theory, easily dismantled by the brutal realities of the Pacific. Local islanders and seasoned sailors rejected the official findings. Whispers of piracy, mutiny, and Cold War espionage began to saturate the ports of Fiji and Samoa. Some theorists pointed to the presence of Japanese fishing fleets in the area, suggesting the Joyita had witnessed something clandestine and her crew was silenced. Others believed the captain, deeply in debt, had orchestrated an insurance fraud that spiraled into mass murder. The Pacific swallowed the truth, leaving behind a vacuum that conspiracy eagerly filled. The legacy of the MV Joyita is written in the missing. The ship herself was eventually repaired, passing through the hands of various owners, forever cursed by the ghosts of her final voyage. She ran aground repeatedly as if the vessel itself was trying to return to the earth, until she was finally left to rot on a Fijian beach. The 25 men, women, and children who stepped aboard in October 1955 were never seen again. No bodies washed ashore. No wreckage from the life rafts was ever recovered. The ocean remains entirely silent, holding its breath over the dark waters of the South Pacific Delta Sierra Juliet, Melbourne. The words echo through the archives of the Australian Department of Transport, suspended in the cold reality of magnetic tape. It is October 21st, 1978. The twilight sky over the Bass Strait is clear, the wind calm. A Cessna 182 liters piloted by 20-year-old Frederick Valentich is en route to King Island. At 7:06 in the evening, Valentich keys his microphone. He asks Melbourne Flight Service if there is known traffic below 5,000 feet. The operator replies in the negative. There is no known traffic. But Valentich is not alone. Something is flying with him. The transmission logs from that evening document a terrifying escalation. Valentich reports a large aircraft illuminated by 4 bright landing lights passing rapidly overhead. It is a machine he cannot identify. The radio operator checks the radar. The screen is blank. There is only the Cessna, a solitary blip surrounded by the vast dark expanse of the ocean. Valentich describes the craft again. He notes its shiny metallic surface. He reports a haunting green light. The object does not fly with conventional aerodynamics. It vanishes and reappears. It plays a lethal game of cat and mouse above the freezing waters of the strait. 17 minutes of radio contact define the entire empirical record of this anomaly. The official transcript reveals a pilot rapidly losing his grasp on the situation, though his voice remains chillingly methodical. Valentich reports the craft is orbiting above him. He notes engine rough-running. He states with a final and devastating clarity that the object hovering over him is not an aircraft. Then, the transmission breaks. For 17 seconds, the microphone remains open. The tape captures a harsh, metallic scraping sound. It is a noise that acoustic engineers and aviation experts have analyzed for decades without reaching a consensus. After those 17 seconds, there is only static. The search operation commenced immediately. Royal Australian Air Force planes scoured the Bass Strait. Sea vessels combed the surface, searching for an oil slick, a floating seat cushion, or a fragment of the Cessna's aluminum skin. The waters between Cape Otway and King Island are notoriously treacherous, a graveyard of ships and planes. Yet, aviation accidents leave signatures. The search for Delta Sierra Juliet yielded nothing. Over 1,000 square miles of ocean were examined. The official Department of Transport file, closed in 1982, concluded that the reason for the disappearance remains unresolved. The vacuum of physical evidence mandates the exploration of diverging theories. The prevailing skeptical theory suggests a fatal spatial disorientation. Night flying over open water can induce a graveyard spiral. In this scenario, Valentich became confused by the reflection of the planet Venus, or perhaps the lights of a distant fishing vessel on the water. The erratic movements of the supposed craft were merely the illusions of a tilted horizon. The metallic scraping was the sound of the Cessna tearing itself apart upon impact with the sea. It is a clinical, rational explanation. It grounds the tragedy in human error and physics. But the official records contain contradictions that resist this neat categorization. Witnesses on land near Cape Otway reported seeing an erratic green light in the sky at the exact time of the radio transmission. A local photographer setting up a time-lapse shot of the sunset captured an unexplained fast-moving object breaking the water's surface in the distance. The negative was examined by military analysts. The results remain inconclusive. Furthermore, Valentish was an experienced, instrument-rated pilot, flying in perfect visual meteorological conditions. The spatial disorientation hypothesis requires ignoring the specific, detailed descriptions of a structured, metallic craft orbiting his plane. We are left with the final 17 seconds of audio, a man, a machine, and an intruder in the twilight airspace. The Bass Strait continues to guard its secrets beneath the turbulent waves. Frederick Valentich flew into a corridor of high strangeness, becoming a permanent fixture in the archives of the unexplained. The file remains open in the court of public memory, a dossier of shadows and static. The sky above Cape Otway is just as vast today. The radar screens still sweep the darkness, and the question remains suspended in the silence that followed the metallic scrape. What exactly was orbiting Delta Sierra Juliet? Such sudden vanishings are not confined to the skies above the Bass Strait. The archival records of the mid-20th century hold maritime parallels that are equally baffling and far more tangible. Consider the MV Joyita, a merchant vessel built for luxury, later repurposed for the rugged trade routes of the South Pacific. In October of 1955, she departed Samoa for the Tokelau Islands. She never arrived. The 69-foot wooden ship simply ceased to exist on the maritime grid, swallowed by the vastness of the ocean. The procedural response was immediate and extensive. The Royal New Zealand Air Force launched a massive search grid covering nearly 100,000 square miles of open water. Sunderland flying boats scoured the planned route between Apia and the Whakaofo atoll. They tracked currents, calculated drift vectors, and monitored the relentless swells. The search parameters were dictated by the assumption of a disabled vessel drifting helplessly under the equatorial sun, yet the islands themselves yielded nothing. Coastal patrols walked the jagged shorelines of neighboring atolls, looking for debris, oil slicks, or life rafts. The maritime distress frequencies remained entirely silent. The Joyita was equipped with a radio transmitter, but no Mayday call was ever logged by any receiving station in the Pacific Basin. It was a procedural void. The search coordinators were forced to rely on blind mathematics, plotting oceanographic trajectories that led only to empty horizons. 5 weeks later, the ocean surrendered the vessel, but it did not surrender the truth. The Joyita was found adrift nearly 600 miles off her plotted course, partially submerged and listing heavily to port. The boarding party from the Tuvalu encountered a scene of calculated ruin. The ship was utterly deserted. All 25 souls aboard had vanished into the Pacific. The consequences of the boarding revealed a deeply unsettling narrative. The ship was unsinkable by design, lined with cork in her hull. The passengers and crew would have known this, yet the life rafts were gone. The navigational instruments were missing. A doctor's bag lay open on the deck, its contents scattered alongside bloody bandages. The radio was tuned to the International Distress Channel, but a severed wire rendered it useless. It was a tableau of frantic, desperate action, frozen in the salt-stained timber. The psychological weight of the missing 25 bore down heavily on the colonial administrations of Samoa and New Zealand. Families waited on the docks in Apia, trapped in the agonizing limbo between hope and mourning. The absence of bodies meant the absence of closure. Rumors began to fill the vacuum of official silence. Theories of piracy, Soviet submarines, and mutiny circulated through the island ports. The emotional devastation was compounded by the bizarre state of the recovered vessel. Investigators found the ship clocks stopped at 10:25. The auxiliary engine was engaged, but the cooling pipes were blocked. The cargo of medical supplies, timber, and empty oil drums remained largely intact, ruling out a simple robbery. For the families, the Joyita became a ghost ship in the truest sense. It was a floating monument to a terrifying, unknown final hour. To understand the anomaly, we must examine the manifest. The passengers were not mere drifters. They were government officials, a prominent physician, and a buyer for a trading company. Captain Thomas Miller was a seasoned mariner, intimately familiar with the treacherous South Pacific currents. He was a man deeply in debt, desperate for a successful voyage, but he was also a survivor. The idea that he would order an evacuation of an unsinkable ship into the unforgiving ocean defies all maritime logic. Something catastrophic forced their hand, a sudden terrifying shift in the environment aboard the Joyita, an event so alarming that 25 rational individuals chose the perilous uncertainty of flimsy life rafts over the safety of a buoyant, cork-lined hull. The transition from a routine supply run to a desperate fight for survival must have been instantaneous. The physical environment of the drifting wreck offered silent testimony to that panic. The main deck was awash with seawater, sloshing rhythmically against the bulkheads. Beneath the waterline, a broken cooling pipe had allowed the ocean to flood the bilges, slowly drowning the engines. The smell of diesel fuel mixed with the stagnant, rotting odor of ruined cargo. Barnacles had already begun to claim the submerged port side, a testament to the long, lonely weeks adrift. Above deck, the canvas awnings were shredded, whipping violently in the trade winds. The tropical sun beat down mercilessly on the empty bridge, bleaching the exposed wood. It is an environment of stark, unforgiving isolation. The final moments aboard must have been absolute chaos. The rising water, the failing light, the sudden realization that the unsinkable ship was a trap. The Pacific Ocean is a vast, indifferent witness. It absorbed the panic, swallowed the life rafts, and left only a listing, silent shell to mock the investigators who sought the truth. The anomaly of vanishing without a trace extends far beyond the ocean. The radar screen in the Air Defense Command Center glowed with a pale rhythmic sweep. It was November 23, 1953. Snow fell in a blinding curtain over Lake Superior. On the glass, two distinct returns converged. One belonged to an F-89 Scorpion interceptor, piloted by First Lieutenant Felix Moncla. The other was an unidentified anomaly, trespassing in restricted airspace. The sweep of the radar arm passed over the coordinates. The two blips merged into a single brilliant point of light. Then the arm swept past again. The screen was empty, no distress call, just the vast, freezing expanse of the Great Lakes, swallowing a 20-ton warplane whole. Records from the Kinross Air Force Base detail a routine evening shattered by an intrusion. The target was moving at 500 miles per hour. Moncla, alongside radar operator Second Lieutenant Robert Wilson, was scrambled into the freezing night. The F-89 Scorpion was a formidable machine, armed and built for the brutal conditions of the Cold War intercept. They climbed through the blizzard, fighting severe vertigo and zero visibility. Wilson tracked the target on his instruments, guiding Moncla through the dark. Ground radar painted the final moments as the interceptor and the target became one. A collision seemed certain, yet search and rescue operations, launched immediately into the punishing storm, found nothing. Not a slick of oil, not a fragment of fuselage. The official accident report offered a sterile resolution. It claimed the unknown target was a Royal Canadian Air Force transport plane off course, suggesting Moncla suffered from spatial disorientation. But the Canadian government issued an immediate, unequivocal denial. Their flight logs from that night were pristine. No Canadian aircraft were within 100 miles of the intercept coordinates. Furthermore, the F-89 was equipped with ejection seats and life rafts. Even in a catastrophic dive, an experienced crew relies on muscle memory. Not a single distress signal breached the static. The prevailing theory among independent aviation historians points to a mid-air collision with a submerged object. Yet a collision of that magnitude at those speeds guarantees a debris field. A darker, more anomalous hypothesis persists within the margins of the archive. The behavior of the target, its speed, its sudden changes in altitude, and its complete indifference to the approaching interceptor matches the profile of high strangeness events documented in classified aeronautic files. The merging of the radar blips was not a collision, it was an absorption. Decades later, a private deepwater sonar expedition swept the exact coordinates of the final radar return. The floor of Lake Superior is a graveyard of perfectly preserved 19th century schooners, but there was no swept-wing interceptor. During the sweep, acoustic anomalies plagued the recording equipment. Bursts of low-frequency static, rhythmic and deliberate, echoed from the bedrock. The evidence remains entirely inconclusive, but the implication is chilling. The lake did not claim the F-89. First Lieutenant Moncla and Second Lieutenant Wilson flew into the storm to defend an invisible border, only to cross a threshold from which no transmission could return. The radar screen at Kinross Air Force Base painted a void that remains unfilled. For the families of the 25 passengers and crew aboard the MV Joyita, the empty horizon offered no such finality. In Apia and the Tokelau Islands, anticipation curdled into suffocating dread as the days stretched into weeks. A missing ship is an open wound. When the vessel was finally discovered drifting derelict, the psychological toll deepened into something far more sinister. There were no bodies to identify. There were no desperate messages carved into the bulkheads. The 25 souls had simply evaporated from the deck. To extract answers from a ghost ship, investigators must strip away the myth and interrogate the physical remains. The maritime inquiry boarded the listing hull as diagnosticians searching for a mechanical pathology. They immediately confronted a staggering paradox. The hull was lined with 640 cubic feet of cork, originally installed to insulate the holds for the frozen meat trade. Even completely swamped, the ship possessed enough inherent buoyancy to remain afloat indefinitely. Captain Miller knew this. The decision to abandon a floating fortress directly contradicted the most basic instincts of maritime survival. The mechanical autopsy revealed a cascading failure of systems leading up to that fateful October voyage. The primary catalyst was a fractured galvanized pipe in the raw water cooling system of the port engine. As the vessel pitched in the swells, this severed artery quietly pumped thousands of gallons of seawater directly into the bilges. The auxiliary engine was already dead, awaiting parts that never arrived. As the water level rose, it drowned the single operational generator, silencing the electric bilge pumps. The ship lost power, lost propulsion, and lost its artificial heartbeat. Yet, the procedural reconstruction of the timeline required investigators to look beyond the obvious damage. The radio logs presented the most damning piece of evidence. No distress signal was ever logged by any receiving station. A technician dismantling the equipment discovered the fatal flaw. A single wire, brittle and corroded, was broken inside the casing. The transmitter appeared to be functioning, glowing with power, but the antenna was entirely disconnected. If Captain Miller had attempted to call for help as the water rose, he would have been speaking into a void. This silence of the void echoes through the maritime archives, mirroring the chilling isolation found on the afternoon of December 26, 1900. The relief ship Hesperus dropped anchor near Ilion Moor, a solitary shard of rock in the Flannan Isles, known to local sailors as the Seven Hunters, 20 miles off the western coast of Scotland. The island was meant to be a beacon. Instead, it was entirely dark. No flag flew from the mast. The blast of the ship's whistle echoed against the basalt columns and faded into the roar of the Atlantic. Nothing answered. Inside the lighthouse, relief keeper Joseph Moore found a deepening silence. The mechanical clocks had wound down to a dead stop. The fire was ashes. Records indicate the living quarters were immaculately clean, pots washed and inverted, the beds made. Yet one single wooden chair lay toppled on the kitchen floor. It was a singular disruption in an otherwise pristine environment. 2 sets of outdoor weather gear were missing from their pegs, but one set remained. Keepers Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur were gone. The official inquiry, led by Superintendent Robert Muirhead, treated the structure as a sealed tomb. The logbook offered the first fragment of a fractured timeline. On December 12th, Marshall noted severe winds, the likes of which he had never seen in 20 years at sea. He recorded that Ducat, the principal keeper, was uncharacteristically quiet. MacArthur, a hardened mariner with a volatile temper, was crying. The psychological unraveling documented on those pages suggests something far more profound than a simple winter gale. The paradox lies in the meteorological data. Mainland weather stations recorded calm seas and clear skies on those dates. The violent, apocalyptic storm documented in the Elian Moore logbook did not officially exist. The investigation shifted to the western landing, a treacherous inlet carved into the rock. Here, the sheer physical force of the unknown left its signature. Iron railings, bolted directly into the stone, were twisted entirely out of shape. A massive supply box, bolted to the stone 100 feet above sea level, had been shattered. The prevailing theory suggests a rogue wave swept 2 men away, prompting the third to attempt a fatal rescue. But this theory shatters against the meticulous habits of the keepers. MacArthur's heavy weather gear was still hanging in the hall. A seasoned keeper would not run into a freezing, violent storm in his shirt sleeves. The final entry in the logbook, dated December 15th, contained only a few words. It stated that the storm had ended, the sea was calm, and God was over all. The men of Elian Moore stepped out of the historical record and into the abyss. Like the vanished keepers, the 25 souls aboard the MV Joyita left behind a mystery that the ocean has never broken. The initial search operation was a masterclass in desperation. The Royal New Zealand Air Force deployed Sunderland flying boats, carving the South Pacific into rigid mathematical grids. They scoured over 100,000 square miles of open water. Surface vessels tracked the projected path from Samoa to the Tokelau Islands, dragging sonar equipment and scrutinizing every logbook from passing freighters. The ocean refused to yield a single piece of debris. To understand the tragedy, one must look to the intended terminus. The Joyita was bound for the Tokelau Islands, a remote territory north of Samoa. The cargo hold was packed with timber, 80 empty oil drums, and crucial medical supplies destined for a hospital on the Whakaofo Atoll. Tokelau consists of 3 tropical coral atolls rising barely a few feet above the high tide mark. Approaching these atolls from the sea is treacherous, requiring precise navigation through powerful, unpredictable currents and jagged underwater reefs. The passenger list was a cross-section of colonial and indigenous society. Among them were Dr. George Parsons, a dedicated surgeon traveling to perform an amputation alongside government dispatchers, merchants, and children. The diversity of the passengers complicates any theory of a unified mutiny. They were a random assembly of humanity, bound together only by their shared reliance on Captain Miller and his ailing ship. A clinical examination of the ship's mechanical systems reveals a cascade of fatal compromises. Records indicate the starboard engine was entirely inoperable before the ship even left port. Captain Miller chose to sail on a single engine, a calculated risk that removed any mechanical redundancy. When the port engine failed, the vessel lost all propulsion. The improperly wired auxiliary pump failed as electrical systems shorted out. The ship was slowly swamping, yet the cork insulation guaranteed it would never fully submerge. The subsequent maritime inquiry meticulously reconstructed the timeline, analyzing water lines and barnacle growth. They noted that the ship's logbook, sextant, mechanical chronometer, and 3 Carly floats were missing. The procedural evidence points to an organized, if misguided, evacuation. Investigators also documented peculiar anomalies on the deck. A canvas awning had been rigged over the deckhouse, a makeshift shelter suggesting someone had tried to survive topside after the engines failed. More disturbingly, a doctor's bag was found on deck, containing a stethoscope, a scalpel, and 4 lengths of blood-stained bandages. The procedural reports state this blood was never typed, an oversight of 1950s forensics, but its presence implies a severe injury occurred before the evacuation. The inquiry meticulously cataloged these items, yet failed to synthesize them into a cohesive narrative. The procedure could document the aftermath, but it could not reconstruct the panic. The ultimate consequence of this extensive examination was a formal placing of blame. The official inquiry concluded that the loss of the passengers and crew was due to the inexplicable decision to abandon a seaworthy vessel. Captain Miller was posthumously censured for his recklessness in sailing with a single engine and inadequate radio equipment. The legal and financial fallout was swift, bankrupting the ship's owners and leaving the families of the victims with a bitter bureaucratic resolution. The examination provided a scapegoat, but it failed to provide a definitive answer as to why an experienced captain would order his passengers into flimsy rafts when his ship was virtually unsinkable. The MV Joyita was eventually repaired and returned to service, but she carried the heavy consequence of her own history. She was branded a cursed ship, a floating tomb that sailors actively avoided. She ran aground several more times before finally being stripped and abandoned on a remote beach. The meticulous examinations, the clinical reports, and the endless theories could never wash away the stain of those 25 missing souls. The incident remains a chilling testament to the limits of human rationality when faced with the terrifying, indifferent power of the sea. The vessel survived the ocean, but it could not survive the weight of its own unresolved mystery. On December 26, 1900, the relief ship Hesperus breaches the churning waters of the North Atlantic, signaling its arrival at Ilion Moor. There is no response. The Flannan Isles lighthouse stands as a monolith of dead stone against a bruised winter sky. No flag flies from the staff. No provision boxes wait on the landing stage. The lamp, designed to pierce the violent Scottish mist, is dark. 3 men are stationed inside, 3 experienced keepers tasked with taming the edge of the world. But when the relief crew forces the heavy iron door, they are met only with a suffocating absolute silence. The clocks have stopped. The fire is reduced to cold ash. Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur are gone. The investigation dossier opens with the physical remnants of a sudden, inexplicable departure. Records indicate the men were meticulous in their duties, yet inside the keeper's quarters, the mundane is violently interrupted. An overturned chair lies on the kitchen floor. A single set of oilskin weather gear remains hanging on its peg, belonging to Donald MacArthur. To step out into a North Atlantic winter storm in shirt sleeves is a death sentence. It is an act of desperation, or an act of madness. The official logs, penned by Thomas Marshall, offer a descent into an atmospheric anomaly. The entries beginning December 12th detail severe winds the likes of which Marshall, a seasoned mariner, had never seen. He notes that Ducat, the principal keeper, is abnormally quiet. MacArthur, a man with a reputation for tavern brawls and a hardened disposition, is crying. The meteorological records from the nearby Isle of Lewis introduce a chilling paradox. On December 12th, the skies over the region were clear. The violent, apocalyptic storm tearing at the minds of the lighthouse keepers did not exist on any mainland barometer. The storm was localized entirely over the jagged rock of Ilion Moor, or it existed entirely within the minds of the men trapped inside the tower. The physical damage on the island's western landing stage suggests a kinetic event of staggering proportions. Iron railings, embedded in solid rock, are twisted and mangled. A supply box secured at 100 feet above sea level is smashed open, its contents violently dispersed. The earth itself is ripped away from the cliff face. Superintendent Robert Muirhead, leading the inquiry for the Northern Lighthouse Board, meticulously documents this destruction. His official conclusion posits a tragic but terrestrial end. A wall of water rising from the abyss, sweeping the men from the cliff face as they attempted to secure their equipment. The prevailing theory suggests a desperate rescue attempt, One man washed away, the others rushing out to save him, only to be claimed by the same merciless tide. It satisfies the board, it closes the file, but it fails to account for the psychological fracture recorded in the final days. It fails to explain the localized tempest. It ignores the solitary set of oilskins left behind and the ironclad rule that one man must always remain inside the light. Experienced keepers do not abandon their post. They do not turn their backs on the ocean. The final entry in the logbook is dated December 15th, written at 1 in the afternoon. The handwriting is steady, betraying none of the terror from the previous days. It reads simply that the storm has ended, the sea is calm, and God is over all. After this moment, the historical record terminates. The men of the Flannan Isles step out of the established timeline and into the permanent dark. The lighthouse remains active to this day, automated and devoid of human presence. Alien Moore is left to the seabirds and the crushing weight of the Atlantic. The archive holds the logbooks, the telegraphs, and the superintendent's neatly typed conclusions. But the truth of what demanded 3 seasoned men open a heavy iron door and walk into the freezing abyss remains suspended in the void. A cold case sealed not by a lack of evidence, but by a fundamental fracture in reality itself, October 3, 1955. The port of Apia, Samoa, suffocates under the heavy, damp heat of the South Pacific. The MV Joyita, a 70-foot wooden vessel built for luxury but repurposed for trade, prepares to cast off. Her destination is the Tokelau Islands, a routine voyage of 270 miles. She carries 25 souls, 16 crew members, 9 passengers, including a government official and a surgeon. The procedural records from the Port Authority note a delayed departure. A clutch failure on the port engine forces the captain to leave on a single engine. A calculated risk. The cargo includes medical supplies, timber, and 80 empty oil drums. The manifest is stamped, the lines are cast off, and the ship slips into the deep blue. The scheduled arrival date comes and goes. October 5th passes without a shadow on the horizon. The radio remains dead. No distress signal is ever logged by the listening stations across the Pacific network. By October 6th, the procedural machinery of maritime rescue grinds into motion. The Royal New Zealand Air Force launches Sunderland flying boats, cutting grid patterns across 100,000 square miles of ocean. They find nothing, no debris field. A 70-foot ship and 25 people have simply evaporated from the surface of the Earth. The official search is suspended after 6 days of fruitless scanning. The ocean does not keep its secrets forever, but it rarely returns them intact. 5 weeks later, on November 10th, the merchant ship Tuvalu spots something drifting aimlessly in the water. It is the MV Joyita. She is found 600 miles off her plotted course, wallowing heavily, partially submerged. The vessel is listing at a severe angle, her port rail buried in the swells. The boarding party approaches with caution, their calls echoing over the water and receiving only the slap of waves in return. What they find upon crossing the threshold of the derelict ship defies every logical parameter of maritime disaster. The ship is completely abandoned. 25 souls are gone. The radio is tuned to the International Marine Distress Channel, but a break in the wiring reveals it had a range of barely 2 miles. The chronometers are missing, the navigational equipment is gone, the firearms usually kept in the cabin are absent. Most chilling of all, the ship logbook is nowhere to be found. The awnings have been rigged to catch rainwater, suggesting a desperate attempt at survival. But the Joyita is practically unsinkable. Her hull is lined with cork, her hold filled with empty oil drums. Even flooded, she would not go down. The captain knew this. The cardinal rule of the sea is to never abandon a floating ship. The families waiting in Apia and Tokelau are left to navigate a labyrinth of agonizing possibilities. The absence of bodies denies them the finality of grief. The void is quickly filled with terrifying speculation. Did a sudden squall wash everyone overboard? Did a mutiny erupt in the claustrophobic heat of the disabled vessel? Did they encounter something hostile in the vast, unpoliced stretches of the Pacific? The emotional fracture deepens as the physical evidence is catalogued. Bloodstains are found on the canvas awnings. A doctor bag lies open on the deck, its scalpels and bandages scattered alongside a heavily soiled dressing. Violence had occurred here. The official inquiry held in Apia only deepens the psychological wound. The commission concludes that the vessel flooded due to a corroded cooling pipe. The water rose, disabling the remaining engine and the electrical systems. In the ensuing panic, the passengers and crew must have abandoned the unsinkable ship in 3 inadequate life rafts. It is a narrative of catastrophic human error, but it requires believing that an experienced captain, a man who knew the cork-lined hull made his ship a giant life preserver, ordered 24 people into the open ocean. The families reject the findings. The investigators close the file, but the haunting image of the empty listing ship refuses to fade. A jarring contradiction emerges from the granular reality of the engine room. The boarding party noted that the bilges were clogged with debris, yet the auxiliary pump, the primary defense against flooding, had not been rigged. Furthermore, the ship cargo of heavy timber was missing. Why would a crew, fighting for their lives in a flooding vessel, take the time to jettison lumber, yet fail to clear the bilge pumps? The physical evidence contradicts the narrative of sudden, blinding panic. There is a methodical quality to the stripping of the vessel, an intentionality that defies the official timeline of chaos. Consider the missing navigational equipment: a sextant, a chronometer, and a compass. These are not items grabbed in a frantic scramble for the life rafts. They are the tools required to navigate a smaller boat across open water. Their absence suggests a calculated departure. Yet, the scattered medical supplies and the bloody bandages point to a sudden, violent trauma. The evidence pulls the investigator in opposing directions: a mutiny leading to a planned escape, a pirate attack resulting in mass execution, an insurance fraud gone horrifically wrong. The Joyita becomes a mirror, reflecting whatever dark theory the observer brings to the table. The MV Joyita herself becomes a silent, rotting witness. Her wooden hull, once gleaming white, is now scarred and blistered by the relentless Pacific sun. The interior smells of stagnant seawater, diesel fuel, and decay. The barnacles clinging to her submerged port side indicate she had been drifting in this crippled state for weeks. The silence aboard the vessel is absolute, broken only by the creak of the timbers and the rhythmic slosh of the trapped water in her hold. Every shadow in the cramped cabin seems to hold a memory of the final desperate hours. The environment is a sealed time capsule of terror. The ocean around the drifting ship offers no comfort. The South Pacific is vast, a terrifying expanse of blue that stretches into infinity. It is an environment completely indifferent to human suffering. The currents that carried the Joyita 600 miles off course are silent and invisible, a slow-moving conveyor belt of water. Beneath the surface, the abyss drops away into crushing darkness. Whatever happened on the decks of the Joyita, the ocean absorbed it without a ripple. The 25 souls who vanished into that expanse left no mark upon the water. They remain suspended in the maritime archive, forever trapped in the terrible, silent heat of October 1955. The Pacific Ocean does not give up its dead. It consumes them. It dissolves the human record into salt and pressure. Yet, on a desolate sliver of coral 2,000 miles from civilization, the ocean made a singular, chilling exception. The dossier on the Sarah Jo begins in the waters off Hana, Maui, on February 11, 1979. 5 men, bound by friendship and a shared love of the ocean, boarded the 17-foot Boston whaler for a routine fishing expedition. The morning was clear. The waters were calm. By noon, the barometric pressure plummeted without warning. A freak gale descended upon the Alaniui-Haha Channel, churning the sea into a chaotic landscape of 80-mile-per-hour winds and 40-foot swells. The Sarah Jo vanished into the storm. A massive search operation mobilized immediately. The Coast Guard scoured 70,000 square miles of ocean over 5 days with cutters and aircraft. Records indicate that not a single piece of debris, no life jackets, and no trace of the men were ever recovered. The Sarah Jo was simply erased from the surface of the earth. The sea had wiped the slate clean. For nearly a decade, the disappearance remained a closed file, categorized as a tragic, routine maritime casualty. Then, the geography of the mystery shifted violently. In September 1989, an expedition of marine biologists anchored off the coast of Taongi Atoll. Taongi is a hostile, uninhabited ring of coral in the northern Marshall Islands, located 2,200 miles southwest of Hawaii. The coral bleaches white under the equatorial sun, a place where nothing is meant to survive. While surveying the desolate shoreline, a researcher stumbled upon a paradox. Half buried in the sand was a fiberglass boat, its registration numbers faded but legible. It was the Sarah Joe. A few yards away lay a shallow grave, marked by a cross crafted from driftwood. Inside the grave, a human jawbone rested atop a neat pile of stones. Beside it lay a stack of blank, square pieces of paper, meticulously interleaved with squares of tinfoil. A 17-foot open skiff had somehow drifted across a vast, unforgiving expanse of the Pacific Ocean, arriving at a microscopic speck of land, carrying a burial ritual that defies all logical explanation. At 7:12 p.m. on October 21, 1978, the radio frequencies over the Bass Strait fell silent. The final transmission from Cessna 182 liters, designation Delta Sierra Juliet, was not a distress call. It was a statement of fact, delivered with a chilling clinical finality. The pilot reported that the object hovering above his aircraft was not a plane. Then came 17 seconds of inexplicable metallic scraping. After that, nothing. A 20-year-old pilot and a ton of metal simply ceased to exist. Records indicate the evening was pristine. Visibility was perfect. The winds were calm. Frederick Valentich was logging flight hours for his commercial license, charting a routine course from Moorabbin to King Island. The Bass Strait is a notorious stretch of water, a maritime graveyard of ships and aircraft. But on this night, the sky was a flawless, empty canvas. At 7:06 p.m., Valentich contacted Melbourne Flight Service. He asked a simple, routine question. He wanted to know if there was any known traffic below 5,000 feet. The controller checked the radar. The airspace was completely empty. But Valentich insisted he was not alone. He reported a large aircraft illuminated by 4 bright landing lights, stating it had passed over him at a terrifying speed. Melbourne radar operators checked their screens again. The scopes were blank. The skies over the Bass Strait were officially empty. What followed was a 6-minute exchange that systematically dismantled the boundaries of conventional aviation, culminating in a sound that has defied audio analysis for nearly half a century. Radar does not lie. It bounces radio waves against the physical world and paints a picture of reality in cold, green phosphorus. But on a freezing November evening in 1953, the screen at the Air Defense Direction Center painted a picture that defied the fundamental laws of aviation, leaving behind a silence that has endured for decades. The airspace over Lake Superior was restricted, desolate, and heavily monitored. At exactly 5:22 p.m., an unidentified echo materialized on the scopes at Kinross Air Force Base in Michigan. It was not a glitch. It was a solid moving target violating restricted airspace near the Sulaks. Ground control reacted with clinical precision. An F-89C Scorpion interceptor was scrambled. This is the anatomy of a localized void. The Flannan Isles anomaly remains one of the most meticulously documented, yet impenetrably opaque disappearances in maritime history. Eilean Moor is a jagged tooth of rock tearing through the freezing currents of the North Atlantic, a place that violently rejects human habitation. Yet 3 men were stationed here to keep the light burning. James Duckett, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur were veterans of the Scottish coastline, hardened against the brutal isolation of lighthouse duty. They understood the lethal temperament of the sea and were not prone to panic. Records indicate that their mandate was simple: keep the newly constructed 140,000 candle power beacon burning. When the relief ship Hesperus eventually breached the churning, slate-gray swells of the North Atlantic on December 26, 1900, the crew expected the blinding sweep of the beam to cut through the winter gloom. Instead, the Flannan Isles lighthouse stood as a dark, monolithic tomb against the Scottish sky. The heavy iron doors were bolted shut from the inside. The air inside the living quarters was stale, thick with the scent of cold ash, damp wool, and undisturbed dust. The mechanical clocks on the wall had stopped, their pendulums hanging motionless in a frozen present. In the kitchen, the reality of the sudden absence became stark. A meal of salted meat and potatoes sat untouched on the table, perfectly preserved in the freezing draft. A single heavy wooden chair lay overturned on the flagstone floor, a silent testament to a sudden, frantic departure. The beds were unmade. Yet inside the lantern tower the lamps were trimmed, filled with oil, and ready to be lit. The glass was polished to a flawless shine. The men had maintained their duty to the very edge of their disappearance. A thorough search of the living quarters revealed a critical anomaly. 2 sets of heavy outdoor oilskins belonging to Ducate and Marshall were missing from their pegs, but a third remained. Protocol dictated that one man must always remain inside the lantern room, sheltered from the elements. Yet Donald MacArthur's heavy weather gear hung undisturbed in the hall. In the freezing, rain-lashed winter of the Hebrides, a seasoned keeper leaving the sanctuary of the lighthouse without his protective gear is not just an anomaly, it is a death sentence. Records indicate the Northern Lighthouse Board demanded an immediate inquiry. Down at the western landing, 33 meters above sea level, the initial survey revealed a scene of violent, selective destruction. Iron railings were bent and twisted out of shape. A supply box had been smashed open, its heavy contents scattered. A massive block of stone weighing over a ton had been displaced high above the high water mark. The sheer physical force required to cause such destruction defies conventional meteorological models for that specific week. The official report concluded that a freak wave had swept the 3 men into the sea. It was a neat, clinical explanation. It was also profoundly incomplete. The timeline of the void actually begins days earlier. On the night of December 15, 1900, the steamer Arctur navigated the treacherous black waters of the outer Hebrides and noted a chilling absence on the horizon. The Flannan Isles lighthouse, a beacon designed to pierce the violent Scottish gales, was completely dark. 3 men were stationed on the remote, jagged rock known as Elian Moor. None of them would ever be seen again. 11 days later, the relief vessel Hesperus approached the island. The crew was immediately met with an unsettling stillness. No flag flew from the staff to signal their arrival. No provision boxes were waiting on the landing. Relief keeper Joseph Moore ascended the steep, unforgiving stairs carved into the cliffside, calling out to a compound that offered only the sound of crashing waves in return. On the night of December 15, 1900, the steamer Arctur navigated the treacherous waters of the outer Hebrides. The crew looked toward the Flannan Isles, expecting the piercing beam of the Elian Moor lighthouse to guide them through the black water. There was only darkness. The light had failed. A lighthouse does not simply go dark. It is a machine of survival, maintained by men who understand that their vigilance is the only barrier between passing ships and the jagged teeth of the reef. 11 days later, the relief vessel Hesperus breached the heavy swells to investigate. The island was utterly silent. The relief keeper climbed the steep, salt-slicked stairs to the compound. The heavy entrance door was unmoored, swinging on its hinges. On the kitchen table, a meal of salted meat and potatoes sat untouched, an overturned chair resting on the stone floor beside it. 3 men, James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, had vanished into the freezing air. They left behind a locked, pristine beacon and a mystery that would consume maritime historians for over a century. The final 17 seconds of the transmission contain no human voice, only a metallic scraping sound, a harsh rhythmic pulsing that defies aeronautical classification. Before the microphone cuts out, a 20-year-old pilot utters his final recorded words to Melbourne Flight Service. He reports that the object hovering above him is not an aircraft. Then the signal dies. The Bass Strait falls silent. It is October 21, 1978. The sky is clear. The wind is calm. Yet Cessna 182 liters and the man piloting it cease to exist in the physical record. This is not a story of a tragic crash. Wreckage leaves a signature. Oil leaves a slick. Shattered glass reflects the sun. Here there is only an abrupt and total erasure from the sky. The Hesperus drops anchor in the churning black waters off the coast of Ilion Moor. The relief ship is 3 days late, delayed by violent gales that have battered the outer Hebrides. The crew expects a routine changeover. They expect the blinding rhythmic sweep of the Flannan Isles lighthouse cutting through the winter gloom. Instead, they find a towering monument of dead stone, no flag on the staff. The island is completely, unnervingly silent. Captain James Harvey sounds the ship's whistle, a shrill, desperate blast echoing off the jagged cliffs. Nothing answers but the wind. The ascent to the compound is steep. The steps are slick with sea spray and freezing rain. Relief keeper Joseph Moore climbs alone. His heart hammers against his ribs. He pushes open the heavy entrance door. It is closed, but unlocked. Inside, the silence is heavier, pressing down like physical weight. The fire in the grate is cold. A single chair is overturned on the kitchen floor, as if someone stood up in a sudden, violent rush. The clocks on the wall have stopped. Time itself has ceased to move on Ilion Moor. 3 experienced men have vanished into the freezing Atlantic air, leaving behind a perfectly sealed tomb, the relief ship. Hesperus dropped anchor in the freezing, churning waters of the North Atlantic on December 26, 1900. The island of Ilion Moor loomed above the gray swell like a jagged black tooth. There was no flag flying from the flagpole. There were no provision boxes left on the landing stage to greet the arriving crew. Most unsettling of all, the towering Flannan Isles lighthouse, a beacon designed to pierce the most violent gales, stood dark and entirely blind. The relief keeper rowed ashore in a small dinghy, the freezing spray stinging his face. His footsteps echoed against the damp stone stairs leading up to the compound. The heavy entrance door was closed, latched from the inside. Inside the living quarters, the air was stale, thick with the scent of unburned oil and cold iron. The kitchen clock had stopped. An overturned chair lay on the flagstone floor. The ashes in the grate were dead. 3 seasoned lighthouse keepers had vanished into the freezing void, leaving behind a perfectly sealed tomb. Official records from the Northern Lighthouse Board detailed the immediate, frantic investigation. The missing men were James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur. These were not novices. They were veterans of the Scottish coast, intimately familiar with the brutal temperament of the sea and the strict protocols of their profession. The interior of the lighthouse offered no signs of a struggle. The lamps were trimmed, cleaned, and ready to be lit for the evening. The oil fountains were full. A set of heavy oilskins belonging to MacArthur remained hanging on its peg, indicating he had left the living quarters in his shirt sleeves. In the dead of a Hebridean winter, stepping outside without protective gear was a death sentence. Yet the heavy outer doors were securely fastened. The only voice left to speak for the missing men was the official logbook, resting closed on a wooden desk. The final entries paint a portrait of atmospheric dread. The relief ship Hesperus drops anchor on December 26, 1900, its iron hull groaning against the freezing swells of the North Atlantic. The relief keeper, Joseph Moore, rows toward the jagged basalt teeth of the Flannan Isles. No flag flies from the flagstaff. No provision boxes wait at the landing stage. The heavy iron door to the Ilion Moor lighthouse is closed tight against the winter air. Inside, the silence is absolute. The clock on the wall has stopped. The fire in the grate is nothing but cold, white ash. 3 men, Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur, have vanished from the face of the earth. This is not a crime scene of violence. It is a tableau of sudden, inexplicable absence. An overturned chair rests beside the kitchen table. A single set of heavy oilskin weather gear hangs untouched on its peg. To leave the lighthouse without this gear in the dead of winter is a death sentence. Yet, someone did the official inquiry, led by Superintendent Robert Muirhead, pieces together a fractured timeline from the remnants left behind. The lighthouse was a marvel of modern engineering perched on a remote Scottish crag, designed to withstand the absolute fury of the sea. It was fully provisioned. The men stationed there were seasoned veterans of the Northern Lighthouse Board. MacArthur was a known brawler, a man of hardened sea salt and iron will. Ducat was a quiet, meticulous principal keeper. Records indicate their routine was flawless. Until December 12th. The logbook, recovered from the keeper's desk, reveals a sudden, chilling descent into terror. The entries, penned by Marshall, speak of severe winds. Winds unlike anything he had seen in 20 years on the water. He notes that Ducat is uncharacteristically quiet. More unsettling, he records that MacArthur, the hardened, fearless brawler, is crying. The engine of the Cessna 182 liters coughs over the freezing waters of the Bass Strait. The sun has just slipped below the horizon, bleeding the sky into a bruised violet. At 7:06 p.m., Melbourne Flight Service receives a transmission that will echo through the archives of Australian aviation for decades. A 20-year-old pilot asks if there is known traffic below 5,000 feet. The response is negative. The pilot replies that there is a large aircraft illuminating him with 4 bright green lights. He says it is playing a game. He says it is not an aircraft. Then, a metallic, scraping sound tears through the radio frequency. 17 seconds of grinding friction, and then absolute silence. Frederick Valentich and the machine he was flying simply ceased to exist. The dossier on this disappearance is a study in abrupt absences. Records indicate the weather was clear, the winds negligible. The flight was a routine cargo run from Moorabbin to King Island, a route heavily trafficked and well documented. Yet the official logs reveal a sudden, catastrophic breakdown of reality. Investigators from the Department of Transport scoured over 1,000 square miles of ocean. They deployed Lockheed P-3 Orion aircraft. They found no oil slick. They found no debris. They found no physical evidence that a plane had ever gone down in the water. The radio transcripts remain the only tether to those final minutes. The pilot describes a craft orbiting above him. He reports that his own engine is rough idling, coughing as if starved of fuel or suffocated by an external force. The vocabulary of the transcript is clinical, but the underlying panic is palpable. The hunter was becoming the hunted. The relief ship. Hesperus drops anchor in the churning, slate-gray waters off Islian Moor. The island is a jagged tooth of rock jutting from the North Atlantic, typically crowned by the brilliant beam of the Flannan Isles lighthouse. But today the glass is dark. The flagstaff stands bare. The welcoming committee of 3 seasoned lighthouse keepers is absent. The blast echoes against the basalt cliffs. Only the gulls answer. Islian Moor is entirely, unnervingly silent. The air is bitterly cold, heavy with the scent of brine and decaying kelp. He ascends the steep, winding stairs to the compound. The main door is unlocked. Inside, the silence deepens into something physical. The kitchen reveals a scene suspended in time. A single chair is overturned on the flagstone floor. The ashes in the grate are dead and cold. Yet the lamps are trimmed, meticulously cleaned, and ready for use. The oil fountains are full. The waterproof weather gear belonging to principal keeper James Ducat and assistant Thomas Marshall is missing. The oil skin of the third man, Donald MacArthur, remains hanging on its peg. MacArthur was a veteran of the sea, a man known for his rigid adherence to protocol. Protocol dictates that the lighthouse must never be left unmanned. Protocol dictates that a man does not step into a Hebridean winter storm without his coat. On December 26, 1900, the relief ship Hesperus breaches the churning waters of the North Atlantic, dropping anchor near a jagged shard of rock known as Islian Moor. The island is completely silent. No provision boxes wait on the landing. The Flannan Isles lighthouse, a monolithic triumph of Victorian engineering, stands blind against the gray sky. Inside, the fire is dead. A single chair lies overturned on the kitchen floor. The mechanical clock on the wall has stopped. 3 men, tasked with keeping the light alive in the suffocating darkness of the outer Hebrides, are gone. They have simply ceased to be. The official inquiry begins not with a body, but with an absence. Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur were seasoned keepers. They understood the brutal, unforgiving mathematics of the ocean, yet the interior of the lighthouse suggests an impossible haste. 2 sets of outdoor oilskins are missing from the entrance hall. 1 set remains. The prevailing regulations of the Northern Lighthouse Board dictated that no fewer than 3 men must man the station, and under no circumstances should the rock be left unattended. To leave the lighthouse together was a dereliction of duty. To leave without protective gear in the dead of winter was a death sentence. The island itself offers only violent contradictions. At the eastern landing, everything is pristine. At the western landing, the scene is one of catastrophic ruin. Iron railings, anchored deep into the stone, are bent and twisted. A supply box, secured at a height of 100 feet above sea level, is smashed entirely. Turf is ripped from the cliff face, 200 feet above the churning foam. The damage suggests a physical force of incomprehensible scale. The relief vessel Hesperus cut through the freezing swell of the North Atlantic, its crew expecting the routine transfer of lighthouse keepers at Ely and Moore. Instead, they found a profound and terrifying silence. The great beacon at the crown of the Flannan Isles was dead. 3 men tasked with maintaining a vital light in the crushing darkness of the outer Hebrides were simply gone.